For most of the 20th century, American archaeology ran on two rules that almost nobody said out loud because they seemed too obvious to need saying. The first one was that the Clovis people came first, showing up around 13,000 years ago through a corridor that opened between the ice sheets. The second rule was quieter, and it did more damage. If something turned up underwater, brought up by a diver instead of dug out of dry ground by a trained crew, it wasn't really evidence. It was a curiosity. Water moves things around. Water mixes layers. A stone tool lying next to an animal bone at the bottom of a river tells you almost nothing about whether those two things were ever together back when they were new. And in a state like Florida, where the whole peninsula is porous limestone honeycombed with flooded caves and sinkholes, that second rule quietly wrote off an enormous amount of ground before anybody even looked at it. Then in May of 2016, a paper came out in Science Advances about a sinkhole in the bed of a small river in the Florida Panhandle. The finds it was built on had been pulled out of that hole back in the 1980s and 1990s and waved away at the time. And the reason they'd been waved away wasn't that anyone thought they were fake. What the re-excavation eventually proved wasn't really about the date at all. So start with the hole itself, because the reason it exists is the reason anything survived in it. The Aucilla River runs down through the Big Bend region of Florida, out of Georgia and into the Gulf, and for a lot of its length, it isn't really a river the way you'd picture one. It crosses the Woodville Karst Plain, which is a thin skin of sand sitting on limestone bedrock, and the water keeps dropping down into that bedrock and running underground before it surfaces again a little further along. The riverbed is pocked with dips and sinkholes, and those dips work like traps. Sediment settles into them and buries whatever's lying on the bottom, and once something's under still, wet, oxygen-poor mud, it stops rotting. One of those sinkholes sits between Jefferson and Taylor counties, about 30 miles southeast of Tallahassee and roughly 7 miles inland from the coast. It's around 60 meters by 45, about 10 meters deep, and today it's under about 26 feet of water. Divers had been pulling material out of this stretch of river since 1959, when Dick Ohms and a few others started bringing up Ice Age animal bones with what looked like butcher marks on them. In 1983, articles in the Florida Anthropologist describing those bones prompted an actual survey run by state archaeologist James Dunbar and paleontologist David Webb of the Florida Museum of Natural History. And while they were working that stretch, a local diver and former Navy SEAL named Buddy Page took them to a spot where he'd been finding elephant bones. A test pit 20 inches deep came back with elephant bone tools, and chips left over from making stone tools. The landowners, the Ladson family, gave the team permission to work there, which is how the site ended up carrying both names. The Aucilla River Prehistory Project ran from 1983 to 1997, and the sinkhole itself got excavated between 1987 and 1997. Dunbar and Webb came up with 8 stone tools and, in 1993, a mastodon tusk with deep parallel grooves near the base of it that looked like cut marks. If you're finding this interesting, be sure to subscribe to understand more DNA from the past. Their finds went nowhere, and the reason for that deserves to be laid out properly, rather than as a story about closed-minded professionals. At the time, a claim like this had 2 separate problems, and either one on its own would have been enough. The first was the date. The layer these things came out of was more than 14,000 years old, which put it well before Clovis. And in the 1980s, that was basically a claim of incompetence about yourself. Jesse Halligan, who'd later lead the diving on the re-excavation, has described the atmosphere bluntly, saying you were a complete quack if you thought there were pre-Clovis sites in the Americas. Every early claim was assumed to be flawed somewhere, and the job of the field was to go find where. The second problem was the water, and this one was genuinely technical. Grooves on a bone can come from a stone tool, but they can also come from a scavenger's teeth, from being trampled, or from sediment grinding against them for thousands of years. Normally you settle that using context. You show that the tool and the bone sat in the same undisturbed layer, sealed under everything above it. Underwater, in a river that's been rearranging its own bed since the Pleistocene, that argument gets much harder to make, and Dunbar and Webb couldn't make it well enough to convince everybody. And nobody went back and tried to make it properly for about 15 years. Between 2012 and 2014, a team led by Michael Waters of Texas A&M, who directs the Center for the Study of the First Americans, and Jesse Halligan of Florida State University, went back down into the sinkhole with modern underwater excavation methods and a much bigger crew, including Daniel Fisher of the University of Michigan and specialists from Minnesota, Texas, Arizona, Cambridge, and Exeter. The conditions were about as bad as archaeology gets. The divers worked at 26 feet in effectively zero visibility, with head-mounted lights, digging with trowels mostly by feel. Halligan described it as being as dark as the inside of a cow. What made it worth doing is the same thing that had made the site suspect in the first place. That old ground surface hadn't just been dropped into a river. It had been buried under roughly 4 meters of sediment during the late Pleistocene, when sea level rose and the water table came up with it, and only after all that burial did it end up submerged. The layers were sealed, which means the context argument, the one that couldn't be made in the 1990s, was actually sitting right there if somebody dug carefully enough to show it. They pulled out a stone knife, a couple of inches long, about an inch wide, sharpened along both edges, found in place in the sealed layer. There's no natural process that makes that object. Dating it came from a pretty unglamorous source. The same layer held mastodon dung, and inside the dung were twigs, and twigs are terrestrial plant material, which is exactly what you want for radiocarbon because they take their carbon straight out of the air instead of out of ancient groundwater. Those twigs came back at roughly 14,550 years old. Stone flakes from the same layer matched. Across the site, the team ended up with 71 radiocarbon ages, which is a lot of chances to catch yourself being wrong. And then Fisher went back to the tusk that had been sitting in storage since 1993. He put it back together and re-examined the end that had attached to the skull, and he found more than a dozen deep, parallel grooves running across it, exactly where and how you'd expect them if somebody were working a tusk out of a dead animal's head with stone tools. So the 1990s reading had been right the whole time. It just hadn't been provable yet. Now there's a second objection, and it has nothing to do with the site. 14,500 years ago, the ice-free corridor wasn't open yet, so how does anyone get to the Gulf Coast of Florida? The answer runs through a Florida you wouldn't recognize. Sea level was around 100 meters lower, and the peninsula was close to twice its present width, with a huge shelf of dry land sitting where the Gulf is now. On porous limestone, surface fresh water is scarce, so sinkholes and deep river holes were the reliable watering places, which is why animals came to them and why people waited at them. This one was a pond in a hollow, next to a spot where a mastodon got butchered or scavenged. Then the sea came up, buried it, and drowned it, which is the part worth sitting with. The very thing that got the site dismissed, the fact that it was underwater, is the only reason there was anything left to find. And it doesn't sit there alone. Page-Ladson is about 8,500 kilometers from Monteverde in Chile, 3,500 from Paisley Caves in Oregon, and 1,500 from the Schaefer, Hebior, and Friedkin sites. And all of those land in the same window, roughly 14 to 15,000 years ago. Dennis Stanford of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, who wasn't part of the work, put the Florida sinkhole alongside sites in Pennsylvania and Virginia as one of the best dated early sites in North America. Here's what actually changed though, and it isn't the number. What changed is where you're allowed to look. Everything on that drowned shelf, every flooded sinkhole and submerged riverbed along the Gulf Coast, went from being a place where evidence doesn't count to being the most obvious place to search, because rising sea level didn't destroy those camps. It sealed them. Subscribe to not miss the next one. But the finding that reaches furthest came out of the mud rather than the artifacts, and it's still unresolved. Running through the sediment layers is a fungus called Sporormiella, which grows on the dung of big plant-eating animals. When there are a lot of large herbivores on a landscape, its spores show up heavily in the sediment. When those animals disappear, the spores fall away. So it works as a rough population counter for megafauna written into the mud year by year. At Page-Ladson, that counter keeps running for about 2,000 years after people show up. Humans arrive at 14,550, and the mastodons and the rest of the large animals don't go extinct until around 12,600. Daniel Fisher put the implication plainly, saying the evidence argues against the Blitzkrieg model, the idea that early hunters wiped out the megafauna in a fast wave soon after arriving. In this part of the continent at least, people and mastodons shared the same watering holes for 2,000 years. And the paper itself refuses to take the next step. It says outright that the role humans played in that extinction is unknown. Coexisting for 2,000 years rules out the fastest version of the story, and that's all it does. It doesn't tell you whether the hunting mattered at the end, or whether the climate did it, or both. There's more the site can't settle. Nobody knows whether that mastodon was hunted or found already dead, which is why the paper says butchered or scavenged and just leaves it there. No human remains have come out of the sinkhole. No hearth, no camp, no dwelling, and the shelf those people were probably living on for most of the year is still under the gulf, basically unexcavated. What remains true about that hole in the Aucilla is unusually specific. A diver showed 2 researchers a spot where he'd found elephant bones, and a 20-inch test pit came back with bone tools and tool-making debris. Between 1987 and 1997, Dunbar and Webb pulled out 8 stone tools and a tusk with cut marks, and the field set the whole thing aside. It was never a fringe claim. It got shelved because in the 1980s, an underwater site couldn't demonstrate the one thing that mattered, which was that its layers had never been disturbed. Its actual artifacts were exactly what the first team said they were. Its actual date, checked against 71 radiocarbon ages, is roughly 14,550 years, and its actual contribution turned out not to be a spot on the timeline at all, but a couple of thousand years of mastodon dung fungus quietly arguing that the extinction of the American megafauna took a great deal longer than anyone wanted it to. There's one more thing about that landscape. When those people were standing at the edge of that pond, most of the country they lived in is now seafloor, tens of thousands of square kilometers of it, drowned when the ice sheets let go. Almost none of it has ever been dug. The oldest site in the American Southeast is sitting 26 feet underwater at the edge of a much bigger one that nobody has looked at yet.